I would assume that George W. Bush had a lot of things he wanted to accomplish during his presidency. Like, when people grow up with a parent as a president and then enter into politics as a career, you'd assume that they have some pretty big ambitions about what they'd do with the country if they had a chance. And that's not to say that W didn't have any opportunity to accomplish things, because he certainly did get some things done during his 2 terms in office. But less than a year into his first term, he was thrown the biggest nightmare since FDR and Pearl Harbor. Bush's presidency is unmistakably the turning point that we look to in a lot of ways to mark the difference in time, in this country at least, between 2 time periods, before the global war on terror and after. And it's my sneaking suspicion that someday in the future, when this course is inevitably split into 3 classes instead of 2, because let's be real, it's a lot of information, they'll probably split it at the Civil War and then at this point here. Now, for the sake of picking a point, we're going to start at 9/11, but in reality, this isn't the start of terrorism in the United States. If we wanted to talk about domestic terrorism, you've got the KKK going all the way back to Reconstruction. Or jumping a lot closer to the events of 9/11, there's the homegrown terrorist activities like the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Even if we're talking about Islamic extremists or attacks planned by Osama bin Laden or the World Trade Center itself, there was a bombing in 1993 in the North Tower. But we're going to focus on 9/11 here because this is where the massive response starts. So, as I'm sure most of us are pretty widely aware by now, on September 11th, 2001, 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center towers in New York, and one into the Pentagon, and then one into a field in Pennsylvania that was meant for the White House. And in the course of this, just over 2,600 people died, not including the people who died years later of diseases they got in the rescue effort. And Osama bin Laden claimed responsibility for it. At this point, bin Laden was part of an organization called Al Qaeda, which was also connected to another radical Islamic organization called the Taliban. He was also extremely well connected. Bin Laden's father was a billionaire in the oil construction business and passed down millions to each of his sons when he died. And Osama bin Laden's exposure to Western influence via the oil industry, and especially American interests in the Arab world, is part of what turned him towards radicalism to begin with. One of his major grievances against the US, in addition to our support for Israel, was that the United States continuously imperialized Arab land, even holy sites, without respect for the place or the cultures. This was especially the case in the 90s, when military women were increasingly deployed overseas to Arab nations, but refused to abide by even the most basic local customs like wearing head coverings in public spaces. In response to bin Laden's claims of responsibility, Bush immediately sent troops to Afghanistan to track him down, which really Congress didn't hesitate to back him up on because everyone here was clearly pissed. Except that at this point, he'd gone into hiding. It wouldn't be until the Obama administration that bin Laden would be captured and killed, something that I actually remember quite vividly because 1, I was overseas at the time, and 2, it was literally like a few days after the Will and Kate royal wedding. But while we were looking for bin Laden, U.S. troops also took that opportunity to get rid of the Taliban government and put in a U.S.-friendly one. But by about 5 years later, the Taliban returned in force, and U.S. troops were forced to remain there while they tried to create stability for this government that we had propped up to begin with. And for the next decade or so, we stationed troops in Afghanistan, and still do to an extent today, to keep the Taliban from just taking over again. Which was a problem because as we stationed troops there, casualties rose every day. So it started off as a quick engagement that had relatively few casualties, then turned into a whole thing where we would literally turn on the news every day and every night and watch lists of casualties just scroll across the screen. And one might wonder why we didn't just bring people home, and as we got further and further into the conflict, that certainly came up more. But in the first several years of this, the vast majority of Americans were committed to what turned into what we now call the War on Terror. Because you have to remember that all of the messaging coming out of this was that we had been attacked, which was totally true. And even for the people who didn't live in the areas that were where the attacks happened, it definitely felt like we had been attacked everywhere, because that's how nationalism works. And so in his State of the Union speech in 2002, Bush drastically expands the scope of what we're doing here, not just to include the immediate threat of who attacked us. He says that it's our goal to, quote, prevent regimes that sponsor terror from threatening America or our friends and allies with weapons of mass destruction. And then he specifically names Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. Now, what exactly these weapons of mass destruction are isn't really clear, and since we never actually found any, we're still not quite sure. But he goes on to say, very much in like a Reagan like evil empire feel, that these states are an axis of evil. And so it's at this point that we go from just trying to stomp out the immediate threat of the people who attacked us to instituting a whole entire war on terror. It's not just good enough to punch back anymore. Now we need to be taking preventative measures because, after all, the US is very much the world's police. And so if we are not going to lead the charge, who is? And so it's with this idea that we end up in Iraq, which I've got to say, as a kid, when all of this was happening, I was in like 4th and 5th grade, this was like heckin' confusing because kid version of me had no concept of Middle Eastern geography and was not keeping up with the differences between Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Iraq, Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban. And so I thought all of these were like the same thing. It took literally until like college for me to straighten all of this out. What we call Operation Iraqi Freedom starts in 2003 with aerial bombing. So in hindsight, maybe we shouldn't have named it Freedom anything if we were going to bomb people, but oh well. Anyway, the point here is to get rid of Saddam Hussein, which, if you recall from our previous lecture with the Persian Gulf War, he was driven out of Kuwait by Bush Sr. in the 90s, but not driven from power. And then his own people tried to get rid of him, and that didn't really work either. So then the UN passed some resolutions, essentially telling him to disarm weapons that he has, and he didn't. So now we're bombing him. And I actually remember this like very clearly, even though I was like 10 or 11 at the time, because my mom grabbed me from whatever I was doing and pulled me into her room where she was watching the news and was like, sit down and watch this because it's going to be important someday, which, like, thanks, Mom. So anyway, the entire premise for all of this was hinged on two things. One, we had some kind of loose connection between Iraq and maybe 9/11. And two, Bush was pretty sure that Iraq was producing these weapons of mass destruction that he talked about in his 2002 speech. And so after the bombings, we invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam and then continue to invade Iraq for, as you can see in the dates here, several more years. And this entire time, we're looking for these weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs as we start calling them, because weapons of mass destruction got really wordy after a while. Also, the entire time, we're working on setting up a democratic government, shocking I know, to replace the one that we, arrested. Which sounds good and all, but this government pretty quickly descends into what I'm going to refer to in the most objective terms as chaos. Because Saddam's essentially socialist government might have been a bit of a dictatorship, but it was also more or less secular. And the extremist terrorists that take over in the aftermath of our failed democratic government are not secular. And so then we have to send in more troops to deal with stability issues, which leads to more death counts that, just like Afghanistan, roll out on TV. And the unfortunate thing about this, in addition to the actual death part, which is fundamentally the problem, is that Americans were getting hit with deaths from Afghanistan and Iraq at the same time. And so the longer this drags on and the more we have young men being sent overseas, which will eventually include my brother, the more people really start asking what we're even doing here. And Bush's ratings start to plunge into an abyss during his second term. On the domestic side of this war on terror, Congress acts pretty quickly to do what they consider preventative measures in fighting terrorism. This comes in the form of the Patriot Acts, which are actually called the USA Patriot Acts in case you forgot what country you're in. And essentially what this does is allow the federal government, so think like NSA, FBI, etc., to spy on you without a warrant if they're doing it in the name of preventing terrorism. So they're allowed to monitor and listen to your phone calls, read your emails, and look at your bank records, among other things. Although, to be perfectly honest, half of what people do today is open and accessible because people post about it online so much anyway, that the government doesn't even really need to do half of this stuff. But the idea here is that they can if they want to or have to. In 2002, they also passed a law that required all aliens, so non-citizen men over 16 from 24 countries, pretty much all of them predominantly Muslim, to be registered, photographed, and fingerprinted. They then immediately began the process of deporting nearly 13,000 of them. In terms of this civil rights aspects of these laws, there are a lot of red flags. And we know from World War II that the Supreme Court upheld the violation of Japanese Americans' rights by being forced into concentration camps with Korematsu versus U.S. And even though a Senate committee found that decision to be wrong, the President of the United States issued a formal apology, and they dished out tons of money to Japanese Americans, the court never actually overturned that decision. So technically, that's still law. And so Congress could say that this falls under that premise, which looks absolutely awful, which is why all of the cartoons that we have on this screen here are like understandably bashing it. But this is technically legal. We also have to understand that at the time that it was passed, literally in 2001, pretty much nobody cared if it was a violation of people's rights. In 2001, Congress could legislate mandatory weekend steak cookouts in the name of fighting terrorism, and all of the major vegetarian lobbyists would line up to support it. That's where the country was. With this came the Department of Homeland Security, whose job it is to actually coordinate all of these anti-terrorism operations. This includes a whole lot of things that we don't ever even think twice about today, but that didn't exist in the way that they do now before 9/11, things like TSA at the airport. That's not to say that there wasn't ever airport security, it was just mostly done by either independent contractors or state-run agencies. Man, I remember when you could carry a whole bottle of shampoo in your carry-on bag too, but because liquids can be used for explosives, we have to limit the sizes of those now. DHS does other stuff too, though. They monitor cyber traffic, sometimes better than others, and they're also in charge of ICE, or Immigration and Customs. The Patriot Acts and DHS weren't the only domestic policies enacted under Bush's presidency, though, because as much as 9/11 and the War on Terror defined his time in office, it wasn't the only thing he did. In fact, in June 2001, so before 9/11 even happened, Bush signed a tax cut into law. This is really kind of a big deal for him, I think, on a sort of personal level, even beyond just normal Republican politics, because his dad lost his re-election campaign after promising no new taxes, and then had to raise taxes. So Bush Jr. being able to cut taxes was important. It also helped that he inherited some of the economic benefits of Clinton's budget plan kicking into effect. The idea here, in theory, was that a tax cut would put money into the pockets of normal Americans and therefore stimulate spending in the economy. So instead of like normal trickle-down economics, this was shooting for more middle of the pack. But if you look at our chart here, you can see that the people who benefited the most from this tax cut were really high-income earners, not average Americans, whatever that means anyway. The tax cut also led to a larger national deficit, which undid most of the work that the Clinton budget plan had done in creating a surplus. Although once we hit the War on Terror, the deficit really just sank into a black hole territory anyway. Bush also created a law referred to as No Child Left Behind. This is, in a lot of ways, the reason that high school students in Texas have to take the STAR test and the TAKS before that, and the TOS test even before that. To be fair, many states had statewide exams before this law, but they were allowed to create their own standards for what those looked like. To be totally fair to President Bush, this law was intended to do something good. What it does is create a set of national standards for public schools with the purpose of improving the educational gap between rich and poor schools. So the problem was that some schools were graduating students with the skills to make it into any college they wanted. Their students were ready to make it into Columbia or Yale or UT or UC Berkeley or wherever they wanted to go. Or if they wanted to go to a trade school or the military, they would be ready for that too. And then other schools that had smaller budgets or less resources based on their location and or histories of systemic racism were graduating students who were barely literate. And this wasn't the fault of the students. In many cases, it wasn't the fault of their teachers either. Funding inequities meant that teachers from different schools were provided with unequal tools to succeed and help their students succeed. That funding and the funding of the areas around the districts also meant that students in wealthier areas went home to extracurricular activities and SAT prep courses and home-cooked meals every day, while others had to work jobs after school to help their family get by and sometimes went to school hungry every day. These things led to dramatically different educational outcomes. And so what No Child Left Behind was meant to do was create a set of standards to measure how schools were doing nationally. That way schools could be compared using the same standards to see where some were falling behind, to see where some needed more help. This was the theory. In reality, what it turned into was a way for schools to compete over awards and extra funding, and a way to punish individual teachers whose students didn't seem to be meeting the mark. Instead of using it as a tool to help, it was almost always and immediately used as a tool to punish. And that's why teachers literally everywhere hate it. But the fact that No Child Left Behind is broken and teachers hate it doesn't mean that something like this doesn't need to exist. For example, the headline here on the left is from 2018. Students in Detroit sued the state of Michigan because in 2018 they were graduating high school without the ability to read. And when they sued the state, they were told, well, that's not technically a constitutional right. Education. Education isn't a constitutional right. Thankfully, in 2020, a federal judge overturned that decision, reminding the state that our nation's history makes it abundantly clear that the men and women who founded this nation thought it was incredibly important for citizens to know how to read and write, that education is the cornerstone of a well-developed democracy, and that these students most certainly have a fundamental right to basic education. The most devastating domestic disaster to impact the U.S. after 9/11 was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. When the storm slammed the coast, it absolutely devastated communities across the coastline. In New Orleans in particular, where the city is below sea level and the levees couldn't hold back the surge, the destruction wiped out entire sections of the city. There were a lot of failures in the response to Hurricane Katrina, all the way from local to federal government. Local government officials told people to evacuate, but failed to realize that the primarily African American communities in the mandatory evacuation zone either didn't have a means to evacuate or didn't have anywhere to go. In the aftermath of the hurricane, state and federal officials like FEMA and the National Guard took days, sometimes weeks, to reach people trapped and in need. Like you can see in the image in the top left, some people were stuck in their homes, often in attics or roofs due to flooding, without food or water for days because the water beneath them was often filled with toxic materials, debris, and dead bodies. For the people who did evacuate, the destruction of the area and the time it took to rebuild meant that a lot of people chose to permanently relocate. And in Texas, for example, a lot of those people, at least initially, ended up in places like Houston, since the Astrodome was used as a shelter, and Dallas. Others ended up in larger numbers in places like Alabama and California. Today, many parts of New Orleans have seemingly bounced back from Katrina, but in some parts of the city, you can still see where things haven't quite recovered economically or environmentally from the damage of the storm. Bush Jr.'s presidency was marked by a lot of tragedy, and when we look at his responses to those tragedies, it's pretty clear that his leadership went a long way to bringing people in the nation together towards a common goal, even if those common goals didn't always produce results that people hoped for. And in dealing with these events, the domestic agenda he may have had hoped to accomplish took a backseat to other priorities. Overall, Bush's legacy in the minds of many Americans is a mixed bag.